Freedom of speech is a lie, Kierkegaard's harsh view. Let's begin with a question that may seem obvious, but grows darker the longer you think about it. But do you actually speak freely, or are you merely performing what you believe will be accepted? We're raised to believe that freedom of speech is a cornerstone of modern life. That, unlike tyrants of the past, we can now voice our thoughts without fear. But Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher who saw through the fog of society's self-deception, would scoff at this modern celebration. Because he knew something most of us don't want to admit: freedom of speech isn't real not because the government stops you, but because you stop yourself. We are so entangled in the need for approval, in the fear of being outcast, that what we call freedom is really just submission in disguise. Kierkegaard warned us of the public, the faceless, nameless mass of people that doesn't think, doesn't feel, and doesn't exist as a real person. And yet we let this ghostly crowd dictate our every word. We tweet for likes, speak to avoid offense, and mold our opinions based on what the collective might tolerate. And then we tell ourselves we are being authentic. But are we? Why? I want you to really reflect on this. When was the last time you said something you deeply believed, knowing it would cost you something? But not when it was safe, not when it was fashionable, but when it was dangerous. When it could have made you lose friends, respect, or even your job. If the answer is rarely or never, then you're not free, you're just well trained.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Kierkegaard believed that truth is subjectivity, that the only truths worth anything are those you suffer for, those you live and die by. And yet today we have confused expression with noise. We think that because we can post, shout, and scream online, we are expressing ourselves. But what if all that noise just drowns out the truth? What if the freedom to say anything leads to saying nothing that matters? Now, let's be honest with ourselves. You and I have both held back our real thoughts. We've stayed silent because we feared the reaction. We've echoed a popular opinion not because we believed it, but because it was safer. We participate in a culture that punishes depth and rewards conformity, and we pretend that this is freedom. Ask yourself, if your deepest belief went against everything your culture stood for, would you still say it? Here's the twist Kierkegaard throws at us. The crowd is not just wrong, it is untruth. Because it allows no individual responsibility. In a crowd, you can blend in. You can say, it wasn't me, it was us. You can hide behind consensus. But truth requires standing alone. It requires becoming a single individual who answers not to the crowd, but to your own conscience. And that is terrifying. We are not raised to be individuals. We are trained to be audience members, spectators, commenters. We react, we judge, but we rarely become. The real battle in freedom of speech is not between you and censorship. It's between you and your cowardice, between you and your fear of rejection, between you and the lie you tell yourself that you're free, when in fact you are imprisoned by your own craving to be liked. And here's the practical part that most people miss. You don't defeat this fear by trying to be edgy or provocative. That's just another mask. The real rebellion is speaking your truth quietly, sincerely and persistently, even when no one claps, even when it's met with silence, even when it costs you everything. So I want to ask you something that only you can answer. What truth are you hiding because it's too dangerous to speak? That question is the beginning of your freedom. Not the kind of freedom that gets likes, not the kind that wins applause, but the kind that makes you real. The kind that makes you human. Truth is a lonely road. Why the crowd hates the individual who speaks let's be honest truth is not popular. It's not fashionable. It doesn't trend. Because real truth, the kind that shatters illusions and exposes the foundations of our lives, always disrupts. And people don't want to be disrupted. That's why the moment you begin to speak something true from your core, something that challenges the status quo, not just politically, but existentially, you will feel the crowd shift. People will look at you differently. Some will smile politely, others will walk away, and a few will attack. And you will realize that truth doesn't unite people, it isolates them. That's why Kierkegaard said that truth is not a doctrine you can transfer, it is a life you must live. And when you live it, when you walk that lonely road, you will encounter resistance not because you're wrong, but because you're no longer playing the game of social comfort, the game of echoing what's safe, and the game of being one of the many. And the crowd hates you not because you're offensive, but because you've reminded them of their own silence. Here's the paradox. We live in a time where everyone claims to love authenticity, yet the moment someone dares to be truly authentic, people flinch. Because real authenticity doesn't fit into a 30-second reel or a curated profile. It doesn't ask for permission. It speaks even when it's trembling. And it reminds the rest of the world that they've settled for a lie. Why is the crowd so hostile to the individual who speaks? Because the individual who speaks freely, deeply, and fearlessly is a threat. Not to systems or governments necessarily, but to the inner cowardice of others. Your courage exposes their compromise. Your clarity reveals their confusion. And your freedom, your real freedom, not the kind they chant about, but the kind you live, makes them realize they've never truly been free. We've built a culture that celebrates the idea of speech, but fears the consequences of truth. Think about it. We encourage people to express themselves, but only within a narrow bandwidth. Say what you want, but don't offend. Be honest, but not too honest. Be original, but only if it fits the current narrative. We've created a sandbox for speech, surrounded by fences of fear. And then we pat ourselves on the back and call it freedom. But Kierkegaard knew better. He saw that the real battle isn't about external speech, it's about interior truth. You can say anything in the world, but if it doesn't come from your deepest self, if it's not anchored in your own suffering, your own questioning, your own confrontation with despair, then it's just noise. And noise is the enemy of truth. That's why when you begin to speak from the soul, it feels like a death. Because it is a death. The death of your social identity, the death of your masks, the death of your acceptance. And that's why most people never do it. Not because they don't want to, but because they can't bear the cost. But what if that cost is the only thing that can make you fully alive? You see, Kierkegaard wasn't trying to make us comfortable. He wasn't a philosopher of ease. He was a surgeon of the soul. And he made it clear, the individual who dares to speak their truth must be prepared to walk alone. Not because they're arrogant, but because they are becoming a self, becoming real. And that path doesn't come with applause, it comes with silence. The silence of being misunderstood, the silence of losing friends, the silence of sitting in your room at night, wondering if you've lost everything for nothing. But here's the miracle. In that silence, something begins to happen. Your voice, once shaped by the crowd, begins to transform. It becomes clearer, stronger, more rooted. And you realize that while you've lost the crowd, you've gained yourself. You've become a single individual, standing not on popularity, but on conviction. And that's when speech is no longer a performance, it becomes a revelation. So ask yourself, are you willing to walk that road? Are you willing to lose the comfort of being agreed with for the pain of being real? Are you ready to exchange applause for authenticity? Because that's the price of real speech. Not the right to talk, but the courage to speak, even when no one listens. The seduction of silence. Why most people never truly speak their mind. There's a kind of silence that's peaceful, the silence of nature, of calm, of deep reflection. But then there's another kind, the silence of fear, the silence of suppression, the silence that grows louder every time you swallow your truth and nod in agreement with something that twists your stomach. That silence is seductive. It promises safety. It tells you just keep quiet and everything will be fine. And most people listen. Most people obey. Because silence in our world is rewarded. Kierkegaard saw this centuries ago. He warned that the individual would disappear into the crowd, and with them, the capacity to truly speak. Not just to make noise, but to speak, to articulate something authentic, eternal, and terrifying. And here's the strange part. Most people believe they speak freely, when in fact, they are only ever speaking within the limits of what they think others can handle, or what they can handle losing. We silence ourselves because we've been trained, subtly, over time, to associate truth with danger. Think about childhood. When was the first time you were told, "Don't say that"? Not because it was wrong, but because it made someone uncomfortable. Or school, where you learn to give the right answer, not necessarily the true one. Or work, where honesty could cost you your position, your status, your livelihood. Each moment adds another thread to the web of silence that eventually wraps around your voice. And then we grow up. We go online. We enter echo chambers that claim to value freedom of speech, but only if it fits the script. Only if it doesn't disturb the tribe. If you deviate, if you say something raw, something deeply personal, something real, you're either ignored or punished. So we self-edit. We present versions of ourselves that are palatable. We learn to survive, not to speak. But Kierkegaard would ask, is survival worth it if it costs your soul? He believed that the self is not something given, but something earned. And the only way to earn it is to go through despair, to confront the absurdity of existence, the weight of responsibility, the agony of being alone in your truth. And here's where most people run, because silence is easier. Silence is smooth. It doesn't offend. It doesn't risk. It doesn't challenge the system, the group, or the mirror. But silence is also a slow death. It kills your inner world. Every time you don't say what needs to be said, a part of you gets quieter. Your convictions fade. Your questions shrink. Then your courage erodes. Until one day you wake up and realize you become a shell, a person who still speaks, maybe even loudly, but says nothing real. So why do we allow this? Why do we choose comfort over confrontation? Because speaking the truth doesn't just risk rejection, it risks transformation. And transformation is terrifying. To say something true, deeply true, is to change the terrain of your life. You can't go back. You can't even speak it. You can't pretend you didn't see what you saw, feel what you felt, or know what you now know. Truth is a door that only opens one way. And let's be clear, it's not about shouting from rooftops or starting arguments at dinner tables. It's about the quiet, internal war between your conscience and your convenience. It's about telling a friend you disagree, even if it shakes the friendship. It's about admitting to yourself that you've been living someone else's dream. It's about refusing to play the role anymore. Kierkegaard believed that the crowd would always choose silence. For the same reason the herd avoids the cliff, it's safer. But the individual, the true individual, they walk toward the edge, not because they want to fall, but because they know that beyond the fear lies something more valuable than peace, integrity. And that's what this is really about. Not just speech, not just words, but integrity. The unity between what you believe and what you say, between what you value and how you live. And that unity cannot exist in silence. So I'll ask you something uncomfortable. What aren't you saying right now that your soul is begging you to speak? We all have that thing, that buried sentence, that unsent message, that truth that keeps knocking at the back of our minds. We tell ourselves we'll say it later, when it's safer, when we're stronger, when the moment is right. But the moment never comes. Because truth doesn't wait, it only grows heavier. And here's the cruel irony: by staying silent to protect your life, you lose the very thing that makes life worth living, yourself. The final betrayal, when your silence becomes your identity, there comes a moment, often too late, when a person looks in the mirror and no longer recognizes who they are. Not because they've changed too much, but because they've hidden too long. They've silenced themselves so often, so consistently, that the mask they wore has become their skin. This is the final betrayal. Kierkegaard warned us about not being silenced by others, but by ourselves. Not censorship from above, but the corrosion from within. The moment your silence stops being a choice and becomes your identity, your voice is no longer just quiet, it's gone. We are not born with a self. We become one. And every time you suppress your truth, you are trading a piece of that becoming for temporary comfort. At first, it's small. A chuckle at a joke you don't find funny. A like on a post you don't agree with. A nod in a conversation where your heart screams no. But over time, these small betrayals stack. They build a life. And here's the terrifying truth. Your life is not built on your thoughts, it's built on your actions. And if your actions are always silent, always compliant, always safe, you may think you're surviving, but you're actually disappearing. Kierkegaard knew this better than anyone. He lived in a polite society, a Christian society that claimed to value truth, but only the kind that didn't disturb comfort. He wrote under pseudonyms, not to hide, but to show how fragmented we become when we can't speak directly. He saw the danger in people who live double lives, one inward, one outward, and how, over time, the inward shrivels and dies. Because the outward always wins if we let it. And this is what makes freedom of speech such a lie. Not because we lack the right to speak, but because we've traded that right for belonging, and for applause, for likes. We don't want the burden of truth. We want the illusion of being heard without the cost of being honest. We want to speak, but only if speaking doesn't change anything. But real speech, Real speech always changes something, especially you. So what now? What can we do in a world that punishes truth and rewards noise? The answer is both simple and brutal. You must speak anyway, not loudly, not for attention, but from the core, from the place in you that still remembers what it felt like to tell the truth before you learn to be afraid. You don't need a stage. You don't need a platform. You just need to reclaim your voice, one conversation at a time, one confession at a time, one no when everyone expects a yes. You don't have to shout. You just have to stop hiding. Because in the end, the saddest fate is not being silenced by others. It's becoming the very force that silences yourself. It's living a life so edited, so airbrushed, that you forget what your soul actually sounds like. It's being surrounded by people who love the version of you that doesn't exist. But here's the redemptive truth Kierkegaard leaves us with. You can begin again. You can reclaim your voice. You can speak the truth, even if it trembles, even if it's awkward, even if it's too late. Because it's never too late to become real, never too late to stop performing, never too late to speak from the depths. So I leave you with one final question. Will you keep living someone else's truth, or will you risk everything to find your own? Because in the end, only one of those paths leads to freedom. And it's the one that costs you the most. The one where you lose the crowd, but find yourself. The one where you stop pretending and finally start to live.